Yes.
I've got a minute to go, everyone.
Cool. I see we are on air.
Indeed. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. There's a question that just came up. Will there be a recording? Yes, we are recording this session, so we will distribute we will distribute the session afterwards to all the attendees and everyone that did register. So maybe just from my side, my name is Willem Kitshoff. I'm the CEO of D6 Group, and it's fantastic to have you all here. With me in this session is G Saunders. He's a data privacy expert. He's been involved with D6 for some time now. And Ross, it's a pleasure to have you on board and have you by our side to ensure that we take data privacy and the protection of information as serious as we possibly can. There's a couple of exciting stuff that we're going to talk about today. It's primarily a discussion between myself and Ross, but I must say, from a D6 perspective, we've been having access and gaining access to a lot of very sensitive information of both learners and parents over the last couple of years, since our inception in 2006. And obviously, data privacy and the protection of our clients' data is a very serious thing for us. We've been engaging on the Popia compliance path for the past 4 years, almost since the first start of Popia becoming a reality. We understand that it's only becoming in effect from the 1st of July, but from a D6 perspective, we've been ensuring that we are as compliant as possible. There's a couple of things that we'll go through today. We did add the agenda to the session in the handouts in terms of the discussion points that we'll go through. But Ross is our expert. He's the guy that has a very good understanding of what needs to be done within a business and what we need to look out for within a business to ensure that we keep data as safe as possible, but more importantly, that we only use data in the way that it is intended to be used. We've realized how many schools use sensitive data, but are not necessarily always sure what they need to look out for, or what they need to put in place to mitigate the risk of possible leakage of data. And Ross, as you previously mentioned, if data is leaked, it's like taking toothpaste out of the tube. Once it's out, you can't really get it back in. And obviously, from a Popia perspective, which is coming into effect on the 1st of July, we want to ensure that we support our schools, but also the parents as far as possible, so that everyone understand what is required by Popia and what type of questions do parents need to ask schools. We're all accountable and all responsible in terms of how we manage data. And from a D6 perspective, we want to support the schools as far as we possibly can with the utilization of data and storage of data, but we also want to inform parents in terms of what should they be asking, so that we can ensure that data is responsibly used, but that we support everyone in the process as far as we possibly can. So Ross, maybe just as a start, I think as a general overview with respect to Popia, and maybe also touch on GDPR, which I think is something that a large part of the market don't even realize. Maybe just where Popia fits in and where GDPR comes into effect also.
Cool, yeah. Popia and GDPR, my two favorite four-letter words. So, Popia is the Protection of Personal Information Act. So literally dealing with personal information and how you protect it. So it's a very literal meaning of the act there. GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation, which is it's kind of become seen as the golden standard as far as privacy is concerned. And it's the regulation that the EU is governed by as far as data protection is concerned. And it's gone through a number of iterations and things like that to get to the point where it is today. And Popia gets us a lot closer to that. And it's quite cool with these privacy laws, because all of them generally come from the same guidelines that were out drafted first in the 80s. And everything has sort of come from that. So if you're complying with Popia, you're a good 60-70% of the way on GDPR. If you're complying with GDPR, you're a good way on Popia. So I think while we're unpacking this, it's going to be quite interesting to see the parallels. But I want to assure everyone that Popia will cover you a lot of the way there too.
Maybe, Ross, just out of interest, GDPR, which is European-based, as far as my understanding goes, if a school within South Africa has a European data subject, so that's the first thing that I just want to identify, what does European data subject mean? That means that the school and the school's process of information should also comply with GDPR and not necessarily only Popia. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah. So Popia applies to the Republic of South Africa, processing done inside South Africa for people within the borders of the Republic. GDPR is an extraterritorial law. So they sort of apply it that if you are dealing with the details of a European resident, not necessarily citizen, then GDPR basically applies to you, and it can apply across borders. And our regulators also said that they would cooperate with that.
And that's been something which has been in place since, I think, in 2018, if my memory serves me right, or 19. When did GDPR come into place?
It kicked in 2016, and then there was a grace period until 2018. So much like we've got our grace period ending now, the grace period for GDPR ended in May 2018.
Okay, fantastic. So an interesting story that happened with me personally a while back in terms of our product development. We launched our D6 Connect application. I think it was mid 2017, and at that point we requested parents to upload their ID numbers within the D6 Connect application in order to match ID numbers that they provide with the ID number on the D6 Plus platform, so that we can do the link between the parent and the administrative backend that the schools are using. When parents submit their information to schools, a lot of these submissions or application forms has loads of information that needs to be captured. And never was that question really raised in the past as to why do you need all of this information and what are you going to use it? What are you going to use it for? Now, in general, most of the information that schools are asking for is utilized in order to provide the service that the schools need to provide, both for the parent and for the learner. But it was interesting. What happened then was when we started prompting the parents to ask or to submit the information on the digital D6 Connect platform, then all of a sudden parents started asking, why do you need this? And the interesting thing was that within the D6 environment, we've been storing that data for the past 10 years. And only when we asked that on a digital platform, then people start becoming aware. So there's a lot of information that is being submitted by parents to schools for the good reason to provide the accurate or the service that is required. But in some cases, certain information might be requested which parents are uncomfortable with. What should schools do first of all, what should the school do if certain information are requested? And should they be alarmed of certain things? And then also, if they say no, what should the schools then do? There's obviously, like sharing photos as an example. Some parents might be fine with that. Some parents might not be fine with that. So what should the schools do in terms of ensuring that they only collate required information? And then also from a parent perspective, if they don't feel comfortable, what's the advice that one can give?
Yeah, so I mean, that's something that comes up a lot, and it ties into some of the stuff that we want to discuss today is, it's not all about consent, and that's where a lot of folks come in that Popia is consent, and I haven't consented to this. But it is more than that, like you mentioned now. So if, for example, the school has to provide a service. Now, within the conditions of Popia, one of the things is that you need to know what purpose you need information for, and you need to keep information to a minimum for that purpose. So when we talk about the application forms and things on there, there's an aspect of a lot of information that is required to provide the service. Now, that talks to having an agreement with the school, a contract with the school that says, I have to give you this information in order for you to provide an education. You are allowed to process this. That said, consent does come into other information as well. So the kind of information that you would use on the application form and for providing education, that's the baseline information that you have to do in order to actually provide the service. Things like media and marketing, it starts becoming a little bit hazier to try and justify the necessity in terms of in terms of
Have we lost Ross there?
Wasn't that exciting? Were you able to see me?
Ross, I think we've lost you there for a second.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
I'm guessing you can't see me, though. I seem to be quite static on the screen.
Indeed.
Let me try and get my camera up and running again. But yeah, so what I was talking about there, just while getting this up and running, is
Oh, goodness. Ross, it seems like I can't hear you at the moment. Sandy just mentioned the last we heard was media and marketing. The boundaries become hazy.
Okay, can you hear me now?
So this time it works. Apologies, everyone.
Are you able to hear me, Willem?
Fantastic. That's much better.
Okay. Not sure what happened there. So yes, you've got to have a knowledge of what's required for providing the education to the learners, and then a knowledge of what's not necessarily a necessity in providing that education. So media, marketing, that side of things, posting someone's achievements in a newspaper or on a social media page is not necessary for their education, which is the service. So in that sort of space there, you would be looking at consent most likely in order to do that. And that's where that consent part of Popia comes in. And the fact that consent can be revoked if someone has given it. And schools need to be aware that that consent can be revoked.
So as far as I understand, obviously, if one can assume that the majority of the information that are being provided and that are requested on these registration forms, that is to enable the school to provide the service that is required, which is obviously in the school's right, and they need it in order to provide the service. But in certain instances, parents must be aware of, in some cases, there might be information requested which is not really relevant to the tuition of the learner. And schools have the right to ask the question, what is this information required for? And in most cases, obviously, I suppose 99% of the cases, it would be for the operational needs and to provide the tuition. But parents should be able to ask. And I think schools shouldn't be concerned about questions that are being raised. I think it's a good thing that we are becoming more sensitive towards the utilization of data, so that we all can help each other to not to be necessarily more accountable, but be more responsible in terms of how we utilize it. Ross, there's also, sorry, you want to make a comment on that?
No, I also wanted to say on that's not to say that there should be a huge panic and drive now to say, like, don't use my information for anything else out there. You can use additional information and that information on the side as well, providing everyone is aware of why and what the purpose is and things like that. Because there are a lot of nice things that are not necessarily just the necessary information that actually benefits everyone in the situation. So it's important to also specify why you want certain information and what it's going to be used for. And often you can justify it really, really well. And if it's protected, then it's also a good thing.
Maybe something that I want to touch on is the types of information that's available. Obviously, you get personal information, but then you get sensitive personal information. And something which I also think is very relevant that people tend to forget is that management of information does not only mean digital information available in platforms that you utilize, your school management platform or communication or learner management, but also papers lying on desks and chairs and floating around within school premise. So it's, first of all, it's not only digital, and secondly, there are different types of information with more sensitivities than other.
Yeah, so I mean, there are ranges of information. So if we talk about information security and that side of things, we talk about information that's either in systems or otherwise, or on paper-based kind of things. So If you've submitted paper-based application forms, there's a lot of personal information on that. If you've submitted digital application forms, there's information there. So there's those sides of things where you have to protect. So paperwork in the real world, physical world, might be protected in a strong room, or if it's not as sensitive, it could be locked in a drawer somewhere or something like that. So there's different ways of protecting paper-based stuff, but then there's also ways of protecting the digital side that you have to have. Now, you mentioned there as well, there is personal information, and then there's sensitive information or special personal information. And then that's where we see a split too. So your personal information is identifiable stuff. It's the usual suspects: name, surname, phone number, email address, ID number, that kind of side of things. When you start getting into special information, that's often where information has been used to discriminate against someone in the past or currently. So it's things like your religion and philosophical beliefs, your race and ethnic origin, your trade union membership, political party affiliation, health information, sex life, your biometrics, criminal record. All of that becomes special information, and generally that'll need additional consent unless there is a legal requirement for having it, which in a lot of cases there is, and in schools' cases there is a legal requirement for processing some of this info.
Especially, I suppose, details of minors. I mean, the school, so, that's what the school is consists of.
Yeah. So details of minors are in their own category as well. They're especially mentioned quite on their own as well.
Okay, now, I suppose all of this is, everyone knows it's coming into effect from 1st of July, Popia specifically. But if one can, both on the school side, what questions could they expect parents will be asking? But then also from a parent perspective, what questions should they be asking their school in terms of data management and privacy?
I think a lot of it comes through to, so one of the conditions of Popia is called security safeguards. And that means that data should be protected, whether it's digital, whether it's physical, it should be protected. And that can come down to policy and contractual agreement protections too. So one of the things that people should ask is sort of, what are the security safeguards in place that protect this information? Is there protection on physical paperwork? Is there protection on digital stuff? The different systems that are in use, are those being looked after the way they should be under Popia? That's, I think, one of the big things. And then also, who is data shared with? We share data on a day-to-day basis in order to provide our services, whether we have hosting systems or software that helps us with things. We share info, and that's fine to do, providing it's protected. So I think it's a good thing to do a due diligence and find out where information is shared, and if it's shared, are there agreements in place? Are there those security safeguards in place?
So I suppose a risk from a school perspective is that schools do make or are dependent on a lot of service providers to enable them to provide the service. So learner management platforms, which has been coming into play since COVID, obviously there's been a massive spike in utilization of learner management systems, communication platforms, platforms like we provide from a school management perspective. Obviously, schools are concerned that their service providers might not be compliant, although I understand that there is not such a thing as compliance, or you are 90% compliant, as an example. And I think that's also an important thing for the school listeners to know, that there's not a tick box to say that now you passed the test. Yes, it's coming into play on the 1st of July, but just it's almost, in layman's terms, how I understand it, the more effort you put into to ensure that you take the matter seriously, and whatever Popia provides as guidelines, that you implement it as far as possible. But there's no tick box as a just to give some comfort. Obviously, that's how the regulator will also interpret it.
Yeah, so I mean, it's exactly that. It's a journey. It's ongoing. The second a school changes a process in the school, or changes the way they do something and handle data, then your compliance goes out of whack, and you've got to go back and see, are we still doing things correctly? Are we looking after stuff? So it is an ongoing journey, and I very much hesitate with the phrase 100% compliant or compliant. It's compliance. You're doing things with the school's processes, the procedures, the policies, and it really is an ongoing journey that you need to look after. And there are providers, and as they change, that's going to change too. So you're very right there.
Two terms within the Poppi realm, and I suppose it's within GDPR also referred to. You get responsible parties and operators. What's the difference between those two? Because I think in some cases schools are one, but then their service providers might be another. So who's who in this environment, and who's responsible for what?
Yeah, that's a very good point. The Poppi brings in this sort of definition of three different categories, I suppose. So one is data subjects, that's who the data belongs to, the learners, the parents, so on. Then you've got the responsible party, and that's the entity that is making the decisions on what needs to happen with that data. So in most cases, that would be the school. Now, on the other side of this, you've got other responsible parties and you've got operators. Now, other responsible parties are places that would get the data from the school and make their own decisions on it, and they have to do all sorts of compliance too. And that could be handovers to departments and things like that. Then you get operators, which are purely operating on instruction of the school. So that's normally like cloud providers and systems providers, where they provide a service and then the school gets that service and uses that transactionally to do things. Now, the bulk of the liability in terms of Poppi sits on the school then as the responsible party. The responsible party has the lion's share, hence why called responsible party. And then the operator just operates on instruction of that responsible party.
Okay, and the data subject is, I suppose, at the mercy of both responsible party and operator to ensure that the data subject's information is utilized in the appropriate way and obviously stored in line with the regulations from Poppi.
Yeah, so the responsible party actually has the lion's share as well of doing the due diligence to make sure that operators are doing things correctly and have security in place and contracts and so on. So it's a very important distinction to know between those two things.
Okay, so obviously we've got a number of schools that have already started requesting us or requesting that we sign specific data privacy and data utilization agreements with them, which we have incorporated into our agreements a long time ago already, since we've started this journey. But what are the specific questions that schools can ask service providers, including D6, that they can ask us to ensure that we are responsible to provide our schools and our clients with comfort that we are using their data and storing their data in a responsible way in line with requirements of Poppi and GDPR? So what are the type of questions that a school can be asking their service providers?
I think probably the two biggies would be making sure that there are agreements in place and that there are some sort of provisions for Poppi and data protection. So talking about specifically operators, responsible parties, or at least what kind of protections are going to be put in place, have been put in place, and so on. The security safeguards condition is although there's 8 conditions of Poppi, security safeguards is probably the biggest one, because that's what stops hacking and breaches and things like that most of the time. So I think it's important for schools to start asking the questions: what safeguards are in place? How is the data being looked after? There's other considerations as well as to how long is data kept. Part of that agreement that you have with your operator is, if you stop working with that operator, what happens to the data that's been put there? If it's someone handling your printing or something like that, do they have access to data that they shouldn't have? And then, or if they have got access to data, once we've terminated the contract with you, that data must be removed. That should be some sort of safeguard that's in a contract. And one thing I want to say on this as well is that one of the things with Poppi is, it's very easy to think of this as becoming like us and them, and you need to supply this and blah, blah, and getting aggressive about it. It's a collaboration. We want to have it as a collaboration. Even the regulator has said that, there's views that they're more a mediator than a punisher. We've got to help each other guide on this. This is new for all of us. So we need to ask these questions, but work collaboratively on it as well.
Something which we've implemented from a D6 perspective was to be, I suppose, as transparent as possible with the utilization of data. So first of all, what type of data do we collect on behalf of the school and the data subjects? How do we use it? Where do we store it? So we've implemented a trust center on our website to be as transparent with this as possible. And I think that's probably a good thing to do, is to be open and honest with how you store and manage data. Because as you've mentioned, I suppose this is a collaborative process that we need to help each other. It's not a throwing rocks towards each other to get people in trouble, but rather to help everyone with this mammoth process of moving away from the old and moving into the new after the Popia Act has been implemented. But transparency is obviously an important thing. What do you do with it?
Actually, one of the conditions of Popia is openness. So like by law, you have to be open and say, like, this is what we're doing. It's specifying that purpose of what we're using data for and things like that. So it's very good that you need to be doing that.
And I suppose it's also from a school perspective, not that I want to go into too much detail in terms of the specific steps that one needs to take to be to move towards more compliance from a Popia perspective, but it's almost also ensuring, just as first, assessing the information that you collate. Some of it might be old stuff. I know that we all sit with legacy application forms and stuff that we normally ask stuff because we've been doing it forever and a day. So first of all, just at least make sure that the data that you collate is actually information that you need to utilize. And then I suppose it's a case of ensuring that data is safeguarded as far as possible, and make sure that your suppliers are at least starting to do things to put process in place to be compliant or to start the compliance journey. Because I do believe that there are certain companies that it's like a bit like an ostrich sticking your head in the sand and hoping for the problem to go away. But this problem is definitely not going to go away. And as you've mentioned, it's a journey. So from a school perspective, I mean, we've been engaging on this for the past 4 years, and I mean, it's going to be continuous. Every month there's new information coming out in terms of how the regulator will interpret certain things. So it's more a case of do as much as possible and as much as you can to safeguard information, as opposed to stressing about ticking a number of boxes.
Yeah, so I mean, the act itself talks about doing what is reasonably practicable. So, you could go all out and implement everything under the sun and bankrupt yourself in the process, putting in all this technology and stuff like that. But it is going to be a case-by-case kind of thing, because not everyone has the same resources. A school doesn't have the same resources as Facebook, and there will be different expectations there as well. So it talks about doing what's reasonably practical. Don't ignore things. Like, there are certain things that you really should be doing with data. Don't say it wasn't practical when someone could very reasonably say, well, you should have put that away there. But you can define your own process. That's one of the beauties of Popia, in that it is not prescriptive that you have to do these 15 things on a checklist or 47 or 700 things on a checklist. You can define, like, okay, these are the 8 conditions we need to comply with. How are we doing that? There's a few things that are absolute obligations that you have to do, but there are other things where you can define your process for it. And as long as you're sticking to those conditions, it's working well.
Maybe just from an administrative perspective, I do see a lot of chats. Obviously, I'm not in a position at the moment to answer any other chats. Can I ask that you guys, all the listeners, just post it into the questions tab, which will give us a list of all the questions that was asked, and then we can either respond later through email on response to all of those, or piecemeal answer them as they come in. Maybe, Ross, an important thing is that I do find in the school's environment, how does the department fits into this realm of data management? Obviously, there's loads of information that needs to be submitted to the department, and it's all fair and well if service providers and the school do as much as possible as they can to comply, but the department does not necessarily play ball, or they do. Where does so in terms of submission of data between school and department, How does that work from a Popia perspective, and who's the responsibility or responsible party in that construct?
See, that's an interesting question, and I think talking about that responsible parties and operators kind of thing, the department is taking information to make certain decisions on it. So I would think that they would be classified as a responsible party. And part of Popia is that Popia applies to public sector as well as private sector. So everyone has to be playing ball with this, has to be collaborative. But whenever there is some sort of data sharing, there does need to be some discussion as to what's happening with that data. How is it shared? Is it shared securely? Things like that. It's the same kind of things that you would ask your operators and your providers. You need to be asking the people that you're sharing information with. So I think it's very important that there needs to be a collaboration, but there also needs to be looking into how the stuff is shared.
And I suppose, I mean, we don't, as a service provider to a school, we don't necessarily have a direct link to the department in terms of engaging directly with them on certain responsibilities that we have as the departmental body. So schools should be in a position where they can ask these same questions to the department to get an understanding of, yes, I'm submitting this data. First of all, is the submission process in line with Popia regulations? And secondly, the department, what are you using the data for? And just ask those same questions that you would have asked a service provider. I suppose those same questions could go to the department to ensure that there's also a form of accountability there.
Yeah, so I mean, when we talk about Popia and those 8 conditions, so it's accountability, purpose specification, processing limitation, further processing limitation, security safeguards, openness, subject participation, and information quality. These are things that everyone has to comply with, including that. So the questions are very valid to ask to the department. And we talk about, in these acts, again, without it being prescriptive, there is the consideration of what is the current state of technology and things like that gets brought in. So you need to, as much as there's security safeguards, your security safeguards should fit with the times and things like that as well. So you need to find out, like, how safe is this data that's being transported? If it's transported physically, what's being done to protect it? What's being done to protect it once it is there, and things like that. That's definitely questions to be asked.
So I suppose a fair comment to make is SSAM submissions. We all know that schools submit data via SSAMs to the department. Schools should be asking the tough questions around SSAM's compliance with Popia, whether it is or not. I'm not an SSAM's expert myself, so I don't necessarily have the information to provide feedback on that. But I suppose that's a fair question, because all the school's information, including learner data, is being submitted to SSAMs, and then from SSAMs to local district or national department. And sometimes these submission processes are happening on a CD or a flash disk that's provided to the local district. So all the safeguarding that we do from a school perspective, if the CD is lost, the information is lost. So I suppose those are questions we are allowed to ask, and we should be asking.
Yeah, I mean, the data moves along a chain, and it works when everyone plays ball together on the chain. There's where's the weakest link kind of thing that you've got to look out for. But that's where that collaboration comes in as well, where we do want to ask the questions of each other and make sure everyone is playing ball as well. And it is a concern if there's information changing hands. What happens to those CDs after the fact? What is the requirement for keeping them? Are they stored somewhere that is recorded and secured and things like that? Or are they not? And should we be securing them better or something like that?
Maybe, so in terms of just technology in general, I suppose age technology versus new, what is better, cloud-based versus not cloud-based? Some schools saying, I'd rather want to just keep it on a flash disk here and store it internally, because then it can't leak to the World Wide Web. Just what's the general consensus or feeling in the market about that?
So I'll split that into two kind of spaces. So one is looking at the different types of info you have, and like you say, keeping a flash disk, and you work on the risk there. So what is the likelihood of something going wrong with this, and what is the impact of something going wrong with this? So if something is really high impact and really high likelihood, you want to secure that a whole lot more. And that's where perhaps flash drives and things aren't the best place. Cloud is nice in that you can have this central repository for things. There's one access point in and out, and all of that. But it's dependent on it being very, very secure, and that it is secured, and that people on both sides of the chain again are playing ball. It doesn't help that a system is super secure and people are using terrible passwords to access it. So there are pros and cons and different ways of doing both. But the other side of this is how times have changed with security. We all receive emails from the banks regularly saying don't fall for phishing attacks, and don't put your emails and passwords into strange forms that will never ask you for this. Don't give your PIN number out.
Or a sticky note against your screen.
Say again?
The sticky note on the screen with your password.
Yes, yeah. Don't put sticky notes on the screen. And times have changed. So there are things now like two-factor authentication, which the cloud gives us. So if we're signing in with the username and password, we get a code on our phone that lets us log in, and then it proves that it's us, and then phishing goes away. And you lose it migrates us to a better state of being around passwords and things like that. I tie that back to the Act, where they say, looking at the state of technology, you want security methods to be modern. Gone are the days where you could have a 6-character password and let's work without antivirus. It's now you need antivirus, anti-malware, you've got passwords, you've got multi-factor authentication. There's so many better methods to securing things now. So being modern has got something to say for it.
Okay, maybe I'm just looking at the chats and questions. We'll go through all the questions afterwards and provide feedback on all of them. But maybe some that I see is things like WhatsApp, photographs of learners, etc. So maybe let's just quickly talk about the WhatsApp environment. There's a lot of questions.
Is that for today? Quickly talk about WhatsApp. That's
sorry.
WhatsApp has serious challenges, I think. Again, this comes back to you need to follow the conditions of the Act, where and I have concerns about WhatsApp outside of even Popia, because WhatsApp is not controlled by the school. There are different people in the groups, it might be teachers starting a group with WhatsApp, and then its parents' details are shared by virtue of being in the same group. And it gets to be a really hazy, blurry area as to whose responsibility is what. And if something goes wrong, and I mean, I work a lot in the corporate space as well, and the amount of libel cases that you see arising out of using WhatsApp is just crazy. So, but WhatsApp is not school controlled. I would much rather say that schools should have communications that they at least are a lot more in control with, that doesn't necessarily share information between people.
Okay. And then learner photos, there was a question around that. And I know that learner photos, I mean, my children attend, it's still a pre-primary, but I know photos are floating around without consent that's been provided explicitly. And one of the questions was, one of the biggest changes that occurred from a consent perspective is you must give explicit consent for certain utilization of data. It's not the case in the past where you had to opt out, as an example. So from an advertising perspective, as an example, you must opt in to receive something. It's not a case of you get it and you can opt out. That was one of the big changes that occurred from a Popia perspective. And I suppose that's applicable also with sharing of anything. There's not a generic everyone is excluded unless you opt out, or everyone is included unless you opt out. You must opt in to provide authorization to use data.
Yeah. So there are two sections in Poppy in particular that deal with consent, one being direct marketing, which is section 69. And that is where you have to get consent before you can direct market to someone, unless you match certain very specific conditions, like someone has already been a customer of yours, then you can work on the opt-out kind of side of things. But then just talking about the processing, what the legal processing of data, the lawful processing of data under the conditions, you have to either be in contract or consent, or there must be a legal requirement for you to process. And that consent, one, means that someone can revoke consent, but the next part of that section of the Act says that it's up to the responsible party to be able to provide proof that the consent was given. So if the regulator asks you, like, when and how did you get consent for this, you need to be able to actually provide proof that, okay, they gave this consent on this date by signing this or by checking this submission or something like that. So it really does change the game a bit there. And when it comes to photographs, this is a big thing in schools, and it's something I'm hoping we start getting guidance from the regulator. You know, we haven't seen cases, we don't have case law. And I would say that no one wants to be the precedent for the case law either. So erring on the side of caution is perhaps a better way of going about it. But, you know, there's significant challenges in that, you know, you can get consent for your own learners, but what if you've got an inter-school event? Then how do you know the consent applies to the other team and things like that? That's one of the big challenges we've seen. But it's also like, you come back to that necessity. If a parent doesn't want to have their child's photo up on media, they have the right to object. And if you are using a method other than consent and you're trying to justify it, they can object again. There's an entire section of the Act that they can do that. So it comes back to the necessity, and it's a lot of the stuff here, some of it is going to need management going forward, and you'll need to change the way we do things.
Okay. Ross, I think we're reaching an end of the session. One thing that I wanted to, or just a comment that I want to make to all the listeners in this session is, from a D6 perspective, those who are current clients with D6, you can really rest assured that we've been embarking on this Poppy process for the past 4 years, as mentioned. Ross has been guiding us both internally in terms of our processes internally, but also in terms of agreements with our clients, how we manage the data with our clients on the D6 platforms. And we really do everything that we can to ensure that we comply with Poppy and with GDPR as far as practically possible. Ross is our, he's been steering the project for the last 3 years almost, to guide us and ensuring that we follow procedure that's been provided by both Poppy and GDPR. So everything that we do is in line with how we should be doing it. Obviously, as Ross mentioned, even for us that's been embarking on this process for the last 4 years, it will continue to be a journey. I doubt whether anyone will ever be perfect, but it is important for all of us to be, first of all, willing to cooperate within this environment, knowing that no one is perfect, and that we shouldn't be scared to ask questions in terms of, what are we doing with the data that we are managing on behalf of someone else or managing ourselves? And that includes the department. And this is not a case of hammering the department in any way, but we should be able to ask the department, both national, but also from a Western Cape WCD perspective. What have they put in place to ensure that the data that we submit or that the school submit on behalf of or to the WCD, CMIS, we know the CMIS platform, what are they doing to ensure that CMIS is operating and has the stuff in place in line with Poppy and GDPR? And these are questions that we must be asking, both from a school perspective and from a parent perspective. And I suppose from a service provider like ourselves, from D6, we should have the answers ready so that we can provide that feedback. And that is our responsibility. So, Ross, thank you again for sharing an overview of Poppy. It's a big topic. It is a hot topic at the moment, and it's unfortunately not something which we can quickly provide feedback and all the answers within this session. Ross does have started more in depth, almost 2-day webinars or 2-day workshops.
2 mornings, yeah.
2 mornings that specifically focused on schools and what they should focus on from a Popia perspective, which obviously cover a lot of these elements that we've discussed today, that schools can register for. Ross, I believe the next session, it's on the 23rd and 24th of June.
Yeah.
And then
so
again,
there will be marketing going out for that soon, where we will be publishing where you can get tickets and all of that for those.
Okay,
and
so
there are also some in July scheduled already as well.
And that's then obviously going into much more detail as to the stuff that we've discussed today.
Yeah, so that's
just maybe a quick outline of that.
Yeah, so it's to educate the principals or whoever's in charge of privacy for the school, to see what is the actual responsibilities, the conditions, things like that need to be complied with.
Okay, so the stuff we touched on, the eight elements that one needs to look at, those are the stuff that you'll be covering in those workshops.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good stuff, Ross. Thank you very much. Thanks to all the listeners. Again, it's a pity we can't go through everything and cover everything, but know that from a D6 perspective, in collaboration with Ross, it's our ambition that we can share as much as possible with all our clients and non-clients, in order to help everyone to become as compliant as possible, and that we support you on this compliance journey. We're in this with you. We're also partaking in the compliance journey. It's not just you. And I suppose for everyone listening, also know that, I mean, we've got 2,500 schools that we service. We've got more than 800,000 parents utilizing our applications from a communication perspective. So data management and data security is probably one of our biggest focus areas that we spend time and effort in to ensure that we comply as far as possible. So Ross, thank you. And thanks for everyone listening. All the questions we'll obviously get afterwards. We'll distribute answers to those questions to everyone that was attended and all of those that could not attend. Maybe just from my side, I apologize for any inconvenience caused in the beginning of the session. Our webinar platform gave us a bit of an issue initially, and we had to move to another platform. So apologies for the hiccup, but I'm glad that there were so many attendees. And this will be the first of many webinars to come between D6 and Ross. So thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.